Hello everyone and welcome back. This is the second video of our Secure Workload and Secure Firewall integration series. In this video, we will cover the configuration walkthrough of the feature as well as the example scenario architecture. So let's jump in. As we mentioned in the previous video series, this is the high-level architecture of the integration, where you need to deploy the Ingest connector to consume nested records from the firewall. Then Secure Workload will automatically generate segmentation policies and push them to FMC. In case FMC is not directly reachable, you need to deploy the Secure Connector. And finally, the policies will be pushed to the firewall. Now, here is the sample architecture, where we have a transparent firewall securing a legacy application in the data center. We will configure Secure Firewall to send nested records, and Secure Workload will generate and push segmentation policies to it using dynamic objects on FMC. We also have different users accessing the application. We will go in more details on the Zero Trust segmentation demo, but just to highlight, we have sales users connected remotely using VPN. We have developers and contractors accessing from campus, and we have IoT devices on our branches as well. Now, let's get started with the demo environment. So here we are in our demo environment. We're currently in the Secure Workload UI, but we will navigate to the Firewall Management Center, where we have our managed secure firewall. We will navigate to Objects, Objects Management, and External Attributes, just to see what is the current status of the dynamic objects configured. And we see that there are no dynamic objects yet defined on the system. Now let's explore how the policies look like. We have a policy in place. In this case, is the East-West policy. And if we click the Edit button, we can see that there is currently one rule in place. This rule was manually created and is currently being assigned to our firewall. Now, we will prepare the Firewall Management Center for the integration, and in this case we need to configure our user. In this case it will be the REST API user that Secure Workload will use to push the policies to the Firewall Management Center. In this case we click Create User. We assign the name for our user. In this case is CSW API. We select the password. And this is important. So the role that this user must have is the administrator role. So make sure you configure the Secure Workload API user with the administrator role. So our user is created. Now I will navigate back to Secure Workload to start the external orchestrator configuration. So in Secure Workload, we navigate to the Manage tab and we look for the external orchestrator options. Here we click on the external orchestrator and then we create a new configuration, and this one we will select the FMC orchestrator. So you can see it's still in beta phase, so it's still for testing purposes, and I will start configuring it. So for the name, just try to use something meaningful. In this case, I will just put FMC demo, and on description the same is for demo. The username is the one that we just created for the API. So in this case is CSW API, and the password you configured for the user. Under these options, since I will be using the self-signed certificate, I will just select it. But if you are using a specific certificate, you can also upload it to the system, so they have trusted communications. As well as if you have your secure workload in the cloud, you must use a secure connector. In this case, I will not select the secure connector tunnel because I don't have a proxy in the middle or something that is avoiding a direct connection between the Firewall Management Center and Secure Workload. We will leave the enable enforcement option enabled, so we can see how this enforcement is enabled on the secure firewall, And in the enforcement mode options, you see that you have two. You have merge and override. Merge will just basically append the rules that are being pushed from secure workload to the Firewall Management Center on top of your existing rules, while override will just override every rule that is in your current access control policy and will just push the secure workload rules. So I will just keep merge. I don't want to override my current manual rule. And under the host list, I will just specify the Firewall Management Center IP, as well as the port number, right? That is 443. So we create our orchestrator. This is totally normal. The connection status will show failure at first. So don't worry about this. It is just the normal process. Once the communication is established, it will change to connected. Let's just give it some couple of minutes. You can also check the current details in the click to show details to highlight this option. And you can see here the current status, right, that is waiting to connect. Let's just refresh once again. And we can see that now is currently successful or connection. If we explore the connection status, we can see that it's completed and there is currently one managed device. So the external orchestrator integration at this very stage is done. We have our user configured to manage the Firewall Management Center from the secure workload perspective. Now, we will proceed to configure the second stage of the integration, which is the connector configuration, so secure workload can consume nestled records sent from the secure firewall itself. So for this, we go to Manage. We select Virtual Appliance. In my case, I already deployed the tetration data ingest. For this, you just need to go to Software, download.cisco. You need to navigate to Downloads Home, Security, Workload Security, Secure Workload GI, and you just select the current version. The latest one is 3615, and you just need to download the virtual machine OVA, and very important for the data ingest. After this, you need to configure some basic parameters to have your data ingest appliance running. So, as I said, I already have the data ingest appliance configured. I will now proceed to enable the connector. And this, we click on the enable connector. We select the ASA connector, and we proceed to enable it. On the initial stage, you will see that it will have this current status that is pending, waiting for appliance service to be active. And this is because the secure workload is pushing the configuration internally to the data ingest that will internally configure a Docker container for the ASA connector within the data ingest appliance. So at this moment, it is just waiting for it to be configured. So it is active, and we can just double check and confirm that it's running on the data ingest appliance. So let's try to refresh. Let's see if it is finished. Just another important note to mention here is that this appliance, the data ingest appliance, it is an OVA file which creates this virtual machine in a VMware environment, and is already hardened by default. In a matter of fact, once these connectors are deployed as a Docker containers, the VM itself, where the data ingest is only accessible through console. So it's only available to access through the VMware console. And when it comes to the Docker container, the Docker container is the one that will have the networking exposed, and in this case, it will just be for ingesting the NetFlow records or the NetFlow records if you're using NetFlow connector. Just refresh again, and we see that our ASA connector is currently active. Also, just to note, the ASA or FTD connector can be used interchangeably. They can serve for both purposes. If you have an ASA firewall or if you have an FTD, keep in mind that this has been rebranded to Secure Firewall. We can see here the current binding. So this ASA connector will be listening to this IP and this protocol. So now let me just grab this IP. We will use this IP later on for the FlexConfig configuration, as well as the port. All right, so we have our ASA connector are up and running. We can confirm here. Now let's go back to the Firewall Management Center and let's configure the FlexConfig required for the secure firewall to export nested records to our to the secure workload integration. For this, first let's navigate to Object Management, then to FlexConfig, and just to note out here in the FlexConfig object, if I type NetFlow, you will see that there are already some default NetFlow configurations for FlexConfig. We will showcase how we can leverage this as well as the text objects, but before starting that configuration, to configure NetFlow on Secure Firewall is pretty much the similar way as what we were doing with ASA Firewall. We need first to specify an access list. In this case, it's an extended access list, which will it will capture the interest in traffic that we want to capture to be exported to the secure connector in secure workload. In this case, you can put something meaningful. I will just put flow CSW to specify that it's going to secure workload. I want to allow this traffic because I want to gather this information. I will disable login. I don't really require login for this information. And for the source networks and destination networks, you can configure it depending on the environment. But for these purposes, we want to grab all the traffic that hits this rule. So it is exported to the secure connector in secure workload. So I just click Save. And this is our access control list, or extended access control list, that will gather the interest in traffic to be exported to secure workload. So we were talking about the FlexConfig for NetFlow. Now, there are some important parameters that you need to understand when it comes to the NetFlow configuration in secure firewall. And one of those is that, for example, we will look at these default values in the text objects already created. This is already in place for you. And we will create our own. But I'm just highlighting these ones so you can understand more or less how to create these values for your own use, right? For your own, let's say, custom created text objects and custom created FlexConfig objects. So this is how you will use them. You just specify a name, and if the variable has multiple values, you just specify the number of values it has and the value it should contain. In this case, we will proceed to create a text object. In this case, I will create the CSW event type. And in this case, I will just configure it as a single variable type, and the variable value is all. I'm interested in exporting all types of event records from Nestle. We configure as well the CSW Nestle destination, and this is where the destination, which is the secure connector for secure workload. The variable typing here is multiple because we will have multiple values for this, and the amount of values will be 3. First, in this case, the first value will be the interface where the traffic is going out. The second value is the IP of the connector itself that we saw later on. It was 10.62.159.70. And third is the port number. And in this case is 4729. Click Save. So with these two values, I'm ready to go to configure my FlexConfig objects. But just to showcase that there is one value that we will use by default, and it's the NetFlow parameters. As you can see, these are basically the normal values that are used, or the standard values that are used for NetFlow configuration export. We will just leverage the ones that we have already in place. So we navigate to FlexConfig objects, and in FlexConfig objects, I want to highlight the current NetFlow objects already configured for you. One that we will use as default will be the NetFlow set parameters. So for this one, you just need to copy the current FlexConfig object, and you can name it as you wish. In this case, I will put CSW Nestle parameter. You can see that is automatically grabbing the NetFlow parameters values from the text object, and you can see the value pair or the default values it contains and how it is calling them. We will go into more details with the other two FlexConfig objects we will create, but just to showcase that in here you can leverage the one that is the default value, and you can leverage it already, and it's already there for you. So I will just click Save. One last tick before clicking Save is that the deployment, it must be only once for this type of object. So for this FlexConfig object, in this case the CSW Nestle parameter, I will set the deployment type only once. So I will save it. And now you can see that this copy of the default NetFlow parameter FlexConfig object is here. Now let's create the other parts of the FlexConfig configuration for NetFlow export, and this in this case is the class map, right? I will just name it as CSW Nestle class map. I will just here write the current configuration that you need to push. And as I was saying before, in this case, it's pretty similar as you were doing in the CLI. So we just specify the class map configuration, class map flow CSW. And in this case, I'm specifying the same name as the access control list I configured before, right? That it was flow underscore CSW. Then for this, we specify the match statement to match the specific access list that we configured before. And here's where we start playing with the FlexConfig configuration, right? We select insert, and in this case, we want to insert a policy object, but it's an extended access list. So we select the extended access list and just put the same name, CSW. And as you can see, we already have our available object there that we just configured previously. You can see how it automatically adds the name of the variable and the default value of the variable, right? So once this is defined, we also need to configure our policy map statement. In this case, it will be the policy-map space global underscore policy, and we want to create a specific class map for this, right? We want to specify a specific class for this. It will be the class flow underscore CSW. And in this case is where we will call this custom text object that we created, right? Do you remember the text object about the event types? This is where we will call them. So in this case, I will just put the variable name as event, and I will select the custom text object that we created before. In this case is CSW underscore event underscore type. And you can see the value that is all. I will just save that. I will put then here my statement, that is flow export. This is kind of similar to what you will do on CLI. Flow export event type. Here is where we call the variable, right? That is, in this case is event. But this is extremely important when you're doing the FlexConfig. If you remember, this type of value, right, it was only a single variable type. So if we want to call this variable type, we just need to select here the specific, the operator get and the specific position of it. So in this case, it will be event.get parentheses 0. So we get this value of all. The next part of the configuration is the syntax itself, that is destination. But for the destination, I need to call as well another text object. In this case, the Nestle one, right? Let's put just here Nestle as the variable name. And you will see here that our object type contains 3, right? 3 variables, values within it. So we will check how to define this one. We can see that we have the variable already called here. And in this case, the syntax requires us to specify the IP, the specific IP to which we want to export these values. So it will be nestle.get, and in this case we want value number 1. That value number 1 will be the IP address itself, 10.62.159.70. So remember, when you're calling the parameters, it starts with 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, depending on how many variables you configured. So we click Save, but before clicking Save, this specific configuration, the deployment type must be every time. This is the only one that the deployment mode or the deployment type will be every time. So that is only for the class map configuration. So we click Save. We have our class map configure or custom FlexConfig object, but we still need one more, and in this case is the flow export destination. Again, you need to think of this as configuring it as classical ASA on the CLI, that you need to configure all the flow export configurations. So I will put the name CSW Nestle flow destination underscore destination. And for this one, the syntax is flow export destination. I will then insert my text object. In this case, the text object is Nestle destination. And I will just write Nestle as a variable name. Oh, I need to fix this. It's destination. Destination. Nestle. First, I want to get value number 0, which is the interface where the traffic will flow out of the firewall. The second one, And this is based on the syntax, right? This flow export destination, the interface the traffic will get out. The second one is the IP, which will receive this flow export records. In this case, they are nested records. And the third one is the port, right? How to send this records, right? Using what port, what UDP port, and this is important because it's UDP communication. This case is the last value, that is 4729. We set the deployment type to once, and with this we click Save. Now we have configured our FlexConfig objects as well as the text object required for them. Now it's time to define the FlexConfig policy itself to the secure firewall. So we proceed to create our FlexConfig policy. In this case, I will just put CSW FlexConfig. We'll select the firewall that we want to push this FlexConfig policy, and we click Save. Here you will see the FlexConfig objects that we configured previously, right? We have the class map objects, and we will configure them as appended FlexConfig. We have the nested flow destination FlexConfig object. We will move it as well to the appended FlexConfig and the nested parameters. You can click Save. And also you have the capability of preview the configuration that will be pushed to secure firewall. So let's see how it looks like, right? Let's see the preview of this configuration that we will be pushing. We see here the output. We can see how it is appending this extended access list here. That is the access list we created. We can see here the class map configuration to match the access list and the policy map configuration, right? So it looks good. Oh, there is something here. Flow event type, destination. So maybe let's just double check this. As you can see here, this is a good exercise just to verify, right, what is actually being pushed to the firewall. So I will just close here, and I will just recheck the FlexConfig objects. In this case, since it's only one value, we don't truly need to specify the value it should get, right? Because it's this variable, is the event, and it's a single value one, which is 0. So it should suffice just specifying the variable name. So let's save it. And let's recheck our policy again. Let's check the preview config. So let's just confirm, and here it is, right? Flow export event type all. That is our variable. So we will just close here and prepare to deploy. Let's click our secure firewall and let's hit deploy. Okay, the deployment is still in process, and we see it's completed. So with this, we have finished the secure workload and secure firewall integration. And just to recap what we did, right? First, we configure the username, the REST API username for secure workload to push the policies to Firewall Management Center. This user must have administrative role. We configure this as our first step. Then on the second step is for the ASA Connector configuration, right? We need to ingest the nested records coming from secure firewall into secure workload. And that is done first configuring the ASA connector in secure workload, and then configuring the FlexConfig for NetFlow export in Firewall Management Center using FlexConfig. So now let's start performing the enforcement for our agentless applications. And for this, we will navigate to Defend, Segmentation, and I will go directly to my agentless application workspace. In this case, is the Invoice app. I will click on this. I already ran ADM on this, and Secure Workload automatically discover all of the segmentation policies. Also, just to confirm, we can click on Matching Inventories, and you can confirm on the workload size that there is no workload with an agent installed, but only IP addresses, right? Which means that only these IP addresses, which are part of an agentless applications, are being analyzed, and the secure workload has produced automatic segmentation policies for it. So we will proceed to enforce these segmentation policies. We will go to Enforcement tab. We will click on Enforcement Policies. We will select the latest version. We can see here the policies that will be enforced on the firewall. So we'll be using the firewall as a networking enforcement point. Here you can see that there are no workloads impacted because these are agentless workloads. So this will be directly enforced in the firewall. Here we can see the scopes that will be impacted, as you can see here, the Invoice app scope, and we will proceed to accept and enforce. Now, let's navigate back to the Firewall Management Center. And in the Firewall Management Center, let's recheck, right, what is happening in the Dynamic Objects tab. So for this, let's navigate to Objects, Objects Management, External Attributes, and Dynamic Object tab. So there are still not dynamic objects defined yet. Let's wait for it. Let's wait a bit, because Secure Workload should be pushing these objects automatically to the Firewall Management Center. Let's navigate back to External Attributes, Dynamic Objects, and here you can see, right, how Secure Workload pushes automatically all of these objects in a dynamic object way, right, in a dynamic object fashion. So any new object that Secure Workload sees gets updated, it will update FMC as well. You can also confirm the IP addresses that belong to these objects. For example, we will download here for the CWeb app tier object. Let's explore the text file, and here we can see the two objects, right? These two IPs, 172.16.16.5 and 162.16.16.6. Let's verify how the access control policy looks like. Let's refresh here. And you can see here that the Secure Workload REST API user modified the policy. Once we deep dive into the policy, we can see that it automatically added all of these policies that you see here. Now, exploring these policies, you can see that there are policies that are called the golden policies. These policies are meant for the software agents to be able to communicate to the secure workload cluster no matter what, right? For example, if you made a mistake in the enforcement, or if by any reason there is something that could potentially block the software agent communications with the software with the secure workload cluster, these rules will allow the control plane and the visibility or data plane of the software agent to communicate with the secure workload cluster. And below it, we can see the segmentation rules for our application, right? These are coming from this agentless workspace application scope. coming to the firewall to be enforced in the firewall as a network enforcement point. Let's navigate back to the device management. Now, we saw how an agentless workload, and in this case, an agentless legacy application, can be enforced using secure workload. But let's also check another use case, right? Let's say, for example, if you want to enforce macro policies on the firewall, let's say that you have a requirement from the InfoSec team, right? Like a business intent requirement to enforce rules that they need to be on top of the priority, always there, and make sure that they're in the environment no matter what. So we have this InfoSec scope. It's applied to a higher level scope, in this case to our DC. I will click on this. And for this scope, we want to make sure that no IoT devices is communicated with our data center, right? So we don't want any camera, any IoT device to be able to communicate with our data center. And for the protocol, let's say that we want to block only TCP and UDP and ICMP, right? I will just select TCP, UDP, and ICMP. So remember, this is a business intent rule from a high level scope that we want to enforce in the firewall as a macro level, or let's say data center wise policy. So we click on the enforcement tab, proceed to enforce the policies. We select the latest policy. Here we can see um, the absolute policy being created and to be enforced in the firewall. The workloads that have an agent and will be impacted by this by this policy, right? So remember, those that there were in those in that inventory are workloads with agent, right? So secure workload recognizes workloads and it will enforce on them as well. But we want to also enforce this on the firewall. So we will accept and enforce, and this is being pushed. Now let's navigate back again to Firewall Management Center. Let's go to Policies, Access Control Policies. Let's refresh. Okay, and here you can see, right, that policies are out of date, and it was modified by the Secure Workload REST API user. So let's check how the rules look like now. And you can see that Secure Workload understood the business intent, right? And it's also translating this business intent to secure workload, and it's putting these block rules that are on a higher scope, right? This is, keep in mind, this is a data center wise rule on top level, right? So we're blocking ICMP, UDP, and TCP for the IoT devices that are trying to access our data center. So secure workload, again, can perform, can push segmentation policies for agentless workloads and agentless applications, as well as push macro policies for example, when you have a data center firewall to be enforced at the data center level, and translate that, keep that business intent and that logic, and push it to the firewall. Now, just to highlight something very important, policy deployments will only happen when there is a change in the policy. If a dynamic object is updated, meaning that a new object is added, or a new object is, or a present object is removed, this will not require any deployment. The Firewall Management Center will get this information from secure workload, and it will push it automatically to secure firewall without requiring any deployment. So again, deployments will only happen when there is a new policy change, right? If we add a new policy, if we edit or modify the current policy. And with this, we have successfully integrated secure workload with secure firewall using the Firewall Management Center, and we did as well the agentless enforcement on secure firewall for an agentless application, and we also did the enforcement for macro policies in the environment. Now, please stay tuned for the last video of this series. We will showcase how secure workload and secure firewall integration can achieve a zero trust segmentation policy, and this will be done live for agentless workloads as well as macro policies for defense in depth. I hope you like this video, and thank you for viewing.